266 men lost in the blink of an eye. The destruction of the USS Maine in Havana harbor on February 15, 1898 was the single worst peacetime loss of life ever suffered by the U.S. military in a single day. The loss of the ship in a Spanish harbor played a decisive role in triggering the Spanish-American War, a conflict that reshaped nations, ended 400 years of Spanish imperialism, and began America's global dominance. But for over 125 years, the mystery of what really happened that day has never been clearly answered. Who really destroyed the Maine? Was it actually an accident? Or was it a conspiracy that sacrificed hundreds of lives to create a war of conquest? In this video, we'll unravel the truth about the ship that changed history. The USS Maine had docked in Havana harbor on January 25, 1898. Its presence was the result of spiraling tensions between the U.S. and Spain. Spanish authorities had been trying to brutally suppress a Cuban rebellion for several years, a rebellion that the American public was broadly sympathetic to. Spanish treatment of Cuban rebels on America's doorstep had caused relations to collapse. It didn't help that Americans had financial interests on the island that were threatened too. The Maine's presence was a symbol of protection for Cuba's American community, and a subtle threat to the Spanish. Despite the tensions, the Maine's time in Havana had been uneventful. Captain Charles Sigsbee assumed that the night of February 15th would be no different. He was sitting in his quarters writing a letter home when the explosion struck. Most American witnesses counted 2 explosions. The first occurred towards the port side bow of the ship, near 2 large magazines of ammunition. Immediately after, a second, larger explosion came from the ship's starboard magazine. In an instant, the quiet evening was transformed into a hell of fire, smoke, and screams. The steel screeched and groaned as it buckled under the force of the blast and the raging inferno. The ship listed onto her side and the electric lights went out. Captain Sigsbee immediately suspected he was under attack. He posted sentries to keep a watch while he focused on coordinating the evacuation of the survivors. There weren't many to find. The crew quarters had been almost totally annihilated in the explosions, and most of the men below decks were either already dead or trapped by fires or the seawater rushing in through the hull breaches. The ship was lost, and everyone knew it. Those men who were still on their feet evacuated whoever they could. Ships from elsewhere in the harbor, including the Spanish Navy, rushed over to help the survivors. The ship sank in a matter of minutes. Captain Sigsbee insisted on staying until the last possible moment to ensure every survivor could get off first. Of the Maine's 355 crew, 266 were lost. Just 16 of the survivors escaped without any injuries. It was the largest single-day loss of American military lives since the Civil War. Captain Sigsbee telegraphed the terrible news back to Washington. Privately, he suspected the Spanish had sent a mine at the ship, but in his message he stressed that he didn't know exactly what caused it, and that public opinion should wait for a proper investigation. Those investigations would change everything. Of course, public opinion did not wait. Every American newspaper carried news of the Maine's destruction, and the nation divided into 2 camps: those who believed it was most likely an accident, and those who were certain that Spain had destroyed the ship intentionally. The jingoistic newspapers known as the Yellow Press openly blamed Spain and urged the government to declare war, rallying to the now legendary slogan of "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Naturally, the Spanish wanted to find anything to blame but themselves. They knew how bad it looked for the Maine to blow up in their harbor and were desperate to find an explanation that didn't implicate them. The Spanish expressed their deep condolences to the Americans and quickly set about investigating the explosion by themselves. On February 17th, a tribunal of Spanish naval officers investigated the wreckage and began interviewing eyewitnesses. Within days, Spanish divers had inspected the wreckage and found that the hull plates were bent outwards at certain points on the ship. According to the Spanish, an explosion must have happened inside for the hull to be blasted out like that. The Spanish quickly concluded that the explosion which sank the Maine had come from within the ship. None of their eyewitnesses reported seeing any external explosions. Witnesses who were looking at the Maine the moment it exploded agreed the detonation happened instantly and seemed to come from within the ship. The conclusion would never be easily accepted by the Americans. Firstly, with relations with Spain in the gutter, no one trusted a word they said. It wasn't as if Spain was ever going to find itself responsible anyway. The Spanish authorities also didn't have detailed knowledge of the ship or its crew procedures, which could lead them to overlook things. Finally, an internal explosion implied a mistake on the part of the crew or a fault in the ship. The Americans weren't eager to take the blame for the disaster without looking into it themselves. Instead, the Americans sent their own investigators, and what they found told a completely different story. The Americans approached the investigation with detailed knowledge of the ship and access to its surviving crew. Captain Sigsbee testified that all proper safety procedures had been followed and the coal bunkers had been inspected earlier in the day in line with Navy protocol. None of the survivors reported any suspicious activity or errors before the blast. By all available evidence, the crew of the Maine had performed their duties to the letter. The Spanish conclusion that it had been some sort of accident was immediately thrown into doubt. U.S. divers descended into the wreck to inspect the damage themselves, where they found several vital pieces of evidence. For example, the keys to the magazines were found in the captain's quarters, exactly where they should have been. This ruled out the possibility of anyone having entered the bunker and set some sort of explosive from within. The divers inspected the rest of the wreck and soon found that the Spanish report had missed something critical. The ship's keel, the backbone of the ship's running along the bottom of the hull, had been blasted inwards at frame 18, just in front of the detonated magazines. If the metal was blasted inwards, it suggested the explosion had been external. Commander George A. Converse, an expert in underwater ordnance and explosions, reviewed the evidence and concluded that it was difficult for me to realize how a purely internal explosion could have produced the damage seen on the Maine. It was widely agreed that no torpedoes existed which could have caused such damage, so the only culprit could have been a sea mine. On March 21st, the Naval Board of Inquiry unanimously concluded that the Maine had been destroyed by a sea mine, which detonated at frame 18 on the ship's port side. The explosion had caused the inward cratering of the ship's hull, and then triggered secondary explosions in the ship's magazine, which explained the outward blasted hull plates. The board did not have the evidence to conclude who was responsible, but the unspoken assumption was that the culprit was Spain. The press, politicians, and the public naturally assumed Spain was responsible as well. Newspapers ran headlines supposedly confirming that Spain had destroyed the ship. The Maine's destruction was a major contributing factor to Congress' decision to declare war on Spain on April 20th. The resulting Spanish-American War saw the U.S. seize control of Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam after 3 months of fighting. It effectively ended Spain's colonial empire and created an international American one. But what if it had all been built on a lie? The official explanation of a mine didn't convince anyone. There were many who believed the Spanish that an accident had taken down the ship. In 1911, President Taft ordered a new investigation to settle the matter once and for all. U.S. engineers built a cofferdam around the wreck and pumped out the water to conduct a full inspection of the wreck. The damage to the Maine was more extensive than the earlier reports had suggested. Still, the engineers set to work analyzing the damage. What they found proved the earlier investigation wrong. The 1898 study had put the mine around frame 18 of the ship's hull, right next to the detonated magazines. Now, with a proper study of the damage, the engineers realized that the damage there was not consistent with an external explosion. More likely, the damage at frame 18 was caused by the magazine explosion itself. The inverted keel damage that had been so shocking to the earlier investigation was, they argued, not evidence of an external blast after all. But they were not ready to throw out the mine theory just yet. Instead, the 1911 team identified a second point between frames 28 and 31 on the port side of the ship's hull, where they said the mine actually struck. About 100 square feet of plating showed serious damage, with some of it blasted upwards and inwards. The board finds that the injuries of the bottom of the Maine above described were caused by the explosion of a charge exterior to the ship between frames 28 and 31, the report concluded. The mine damaged the hull and set off the magazines, which resulted in the second explosion that actually destroyed the ship. In some ways, it was a confirmation of the previous explanation. But the shift in location confirmed that the original investigation had been wrong, and many questions still went unanswered. The following year, the Maine's wreckage was refloated, towed out to sea, and sunk several miles off the Cuban coast, taking its secrets down with it to the briny depths. However, the key question remained: who actually blew up the Maine? Finding an answer would allow the souls of the dead to rest. As it turned out, answering that question was far more difficult than anyone expected. The obvious suspect would be the Spanish. Havana was a Spanish-controlled harbor with a Spanish military presence at a time when tensions with Spain were high. But why would the Spanish provoke the Americans like that? While it's true that Spain had a distorted sense of its own strength going into the war, it is difficult to believe they would have casually provoked conflict by staging such an audacious attack. Spain's scrambling to explain the explosion away as an accident shows that Spain was terrified of being found responsible. Such an attack on an anchored ship during peacetime would make Spain an international pariah and give the U.S. all the justification it needed to attack, not to mention that the explosion posed a serious risk to Havana and Spanish personnel in the harbor. Besides, the Maine was just one battleship, and the U.S. had plenty of others, so destroying it would not even begin to seriously harm the U.S. naval power, as was the Japanese intention at Pearl Harbor in 1941. Put simply, Spain stood to gain almost nothing by destroying the Maine in exchange for making the situation infinitely worse in every other regard. Something wasn't adding up. Just because the Spanish government wasn't clearly involved, that didn't mean Spanish people weren't. Captain Sigsbee believed that Spanish dissidents in Cuba who weren't happy with the U.S. presence were behind the attack. The captain suspected that as many as a dozen men could have rigged the mine and brought it close to the Maine using a small boat, then set it to drift into the ship without being noticed. Then again, it had to be conceded that Spanish regulations on private ownership of explosives were strict. Was it even practical for dissidents to acquire enough explosives to sink a battleship? It certainly wasn't likely. And the same questions of what the Spanish hoped to gain by the act were still unanswered. Whether done by government or private actors, it was still likely to provoke a war. But what if that was the point? What if the destruction of Maine was engineered by someone who wanted the war in the first place? Another theory is that it was a false flag engineered by Cuban rebels, or even the U.S. itself to create justification for war. This theory is difficult to sustain, though. Firstly, the possibility of Cuban rebels setting up either an internal or external explosion is doubtful. There is no evidence of direct contact between Cuban rebels and the Maine that could have allowed the rebels to get on board peacefully, and it would have been almost impossible for them to sneak aboard and plant a bomb large enough to sink the ship. The Cuban rebels were never recorded as using sea mines at any point in the war, and even if they had, it would have been practically impossible to deploy one in Havana harbor without being noticed. No eyewitness accounts or physical evidence suggested Cuban rebels were anywhere near Havana or the Maine at the time of the attack. Therefore, a Cuban false flag is pure speculation. As for the United States being behind the attack, this is too impractical. The obvious reason is that it wasn't needed. The U.S. public was already inclined towards war before the Maine explosion. Tensions with Spain were the reason the Maine was sent there in the first place. There's no reason why the U.S. would need to arrange the deaths of almost 300 of its own men, and the loss of a battleship when so much public support already existed. Even stronger evidence that the Maine wasn't a U.S. organized false flag is that the Maine was only mentioned in passing when it came to declaring war. During his speech on April 11, 1898, where he asked for Congress to declare war, President McKinley only alluded to the Maine's destruction, and instead focused on Spanish treatment of Cuban rebels and threats to Americans in Cuba, problems that predated the Maine's arrival in Havana. It is difficult to believe that the U.S. would arrange the death of 268 of its own men to start a war the public already wanted, and then proceeded to gloss over the attack when it came to actually declaring that war. Nevertheless, this is the official view of the Cuban government, who added an inscription to the memorial in Havana harbor with the following words: "To the victims of the Maine who were sacrificed by the imperialist veracity and their desire to gain control of the island of Cuba." Several other things didn't add up about the mine theory either. Firstly, the practicality of setting up a mine to attack the Maine is questionable. If it was a mine, then it would have had to have been laid beforehand, or it was moved into position on the day, neither of which seem likely. The Maine docked in Havana on January 25th, 3 weeks before the explosion, and was stationary for a long time before the attack. While the Maine did inform the Spanish of its arrival beforehand, giving time for a mine to be laid, could it have gone undetected and undetonated for so long? It would have taken a small team of men to lay the mine on the day, but to do so without anyone in Havana or on board the Maine noticing anything suspicious was unlikely. Other details didn't add up either. An underwater explosion would come with other evidence that simply didn't exist. Underwater detonations send up spouts of water, but not a single eyewitness reported seeing such a thing on the day. Mine explosions were also known to kill fish in the area, but there were no reports of any dead fish after the Maine explosion, nor did any witnesses report the characteristic ground shaking consistent with a mine detonating close to shore. Conditions on the day were also an issue. There was virtually no wind and the water had been smooth and calm. Sea mines require a moderate amount of force to detonate on contact, which would not have been likely on a stationary ship in such calm conditions. The only conclusion was that the mine must have been detonated electronically. But electronic detonation requires wires and a control station, and there wasn't any evidence of either of those things. As a result of these issues and many others, there were plenty of people who didn't buy the mine theory. The most vocal early critic was Lieutenant Colonel John Bucknell of Britain's Royal Engineers. As one of the world's leading experts on sea mines, his arguments carried a lot of weight, but he was not impressed with the official conclusions. He laid out numerous practical problems with the mine theory. For example, the proposed point of contact between the mine and the ship was so low that the mine would have been more likely to get caught on the seafloor than actually hit its target. Other critics noted that the mines rarely, if ever, detonated a ship's magazine. In fact, multiple U.S. ships would run into Spanish mines during the war, and none of them suffered damage anything like the Maine. These questions would burn away for decades until a new investigation blew the mystery wide open. In 1974, Admiral Hyman Rickover commissioned a new study to determine the true cause of the explosion. A team of experts, including qualified engineers and historians, pored over records and photos from the wreck, and combined it with information from numerous other ships and sinkings. After extensive study, they concluded that the explosion had not come from the mine. It had come from inside the vessel itself. This investigation concluded that a spontaneous fire had broken out in the A-16 coal bunker several hours before the explosion. The heat eventually triggered an explosion in the adjacent magazine, which in turn triggered secondary explosions elsewhere in the ship. Coal fires had actually been a repeated problem on American ships at the time. In the 3 years preceding the Maine explosion, 13 other American ships had experienced spontaneous coal fires, with some of those 13 reporting multiple separate fires. The bituminous coal the Maine was using was known to produce fire damp, a collection of highly flammable gases if not stored correctly. The Maine was found to have an adequate ventilation to safely remove these gases. Modern analysis found that it would have taken just 4 hours for a spontaneous coal fire to burn hot enough to trigger an explosion in the neighboring magazine. The standard protocol on the Maine was to inspect the coal bunkers every 12 hours, more than enough time for a disaster to unfold. The study found that the inverted keel was the result of the sides and decks of the ship being blown out with more force than the bottom, which was supported by water. The damage between frames 28 and 33 was not as extensive as the report had implied, and didn't show damage consistent with the mine blast. An internal explosion would explain why no one actually saw an external explosion. It would also explain why so much of the hull was blown outward. The inward bending of the keel and some other plating was concluded to have been the result of the buckling of the ship's hull after the explosion and the massive amounts of water rushing in through the breaches afterwards. It was possible for a mine to have triggered the explosion, but the same 1998 study calculated that the mine would need to be perfectly placed to trigger such a blast, a feat that would have required more luck than skill. The obvious answer is that people wanted it to be true. There was a powerful pro-war voice in the U.S. that wanted to fight Spain over Cuba before the Maine disaster. Many people made up their mind as soon as the news broke, and were never going to change it. Media moguls like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer loudly banged the war drum, drowning out anyone who questioned the idea of going to war. Another reason is that no one wanted to admit it was their fault. To be fair to the crew of the Maine, they were following standard safety protocols. The problem was that those safety protocols weren't good enough. To publicly admit that an accident had taken down a warship and almost 300 crew with it meant one of two things: that the U.S. Navy was so incompetent that it allowed such a mistake to happen, or that the accident happened in spite of them doing everything right, which raised safety questions for every ship in the fleet. It was much more convenient for Navy leadership to shift blame onto something else. There's also an element of time. Modern technology and improved understanding of engineering and physics allowed experts to get a more accurate view of what happened. The 1898 investigators were basing their conclusions on a mix of eyewitness accounts, speculation, and low-visibility dives into the mangled wreck. The 1911 investigation went in with a conclusion already in place. It didn't help that both investigations declined to bring in outside experts with relevant knowledge in engineering, explosives, or other relevant issues. But even so, questions remain. The inward bending of the hull plates could be explained by rushing water and buckling steel, but some experts still believe it could have been caused by a sea mine. The fact remains that Captain Sigsbee and many of the other people who were actually there were convinced that it was a mine as well. Should the claims of modern experts automatically override eyewitness experience? Most scholars today accept that the destruction of the Maine was the result of a tragic accident following a coal fire in its bunker. The United States had been wrong to blame Spain. But given the quality of evidence and knowledge at the time, the error was most likely an honest one. However, with all the people involved long dead, and the ship's remains decaying beneath the waves, the chance to settle the question may have already faded. The truth about what happened to the Maine may be lost forever, along with 266 souls who went down with her.